Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video, I need to create a tapering jig, which will be used in the next project. 30 to 35 years ago, I created a single-use tapering jig that looks like this here that I have on the workbench. And what it allowed me to do was to take a 4x6 board and set it on here, just like that. And then I could run it through the table saw, just like this, and I could cut this edge here smooth, because this was the most critical face to have smooth on these legs, because the arm boards would tie into this, and they had to tie in at a 7-degree angle. And so this front face was critical. I cut this tapering jig freehand on a 10-inch table saw. That's something that you definitely should not do. However, the saw I was using had a 1.5 horsepower motor, I believe, if I did this on my 10-inch Delta contractor saw, or it had a 3/4 horsepower motor if I did it on the table saw that I borrowed before I bought that 10-inch Delta table saw. And so we're going to create a more universal tapering jig in today's video. What I've got here is a portion of a handy panel that you can pick up at one of the big box stores. This is a leftover piece from one of the other projects where I'd use this 2-foot by 4-foot piece. It's still roughly 2 feet across. It's actually an 1/8 inch less than 2 feet across, and it's about an 1/8 inch less than 31 inches in this dimension. So I'll be using this board for my tapering jig, and what I planned on doing is putting in dovetails going across that allow me to use these MatchFit squeeze clamps to hold the board down to it. And then also I could use other MatchFit hardware and attach stops to various different locations on this board. If I didn't need to use the clamps, I could just use those stops, similar to the way I used the cutout back here in this area of the single-purpose jig. So let's get started on that now. I'll get started by creating a board that's going to go into the miter gauge slot, and that board will be attached to the bottom of this as a runner. And so this will run through the miter gauge slot instead of using the rip fence. Well, I think I can get the runner board out of this. The runner's got to be 3/8 inch tall by 3/4 inch thick. The board is 3/4 inch thick in this dimension, and so that's good. Unfortunately, there's a lot of defects in this board. There's some bug rot up in this area here. There's quite a few knots in the board. There's also some area here that did not get cleaned up at the planer. So what I should be able to do, I believe, is to take the runner out of this section right through here. This is a jointed edge right now on the board. This edge over here has not been jointed, not been straightened yet. And so what I need to do first then is run the board through with this edge against the rip fence, and that'll get me a straight edge out here, and then I can flip the board over, and then I can get rid of this section of the board here that includes that knot, and then I should be able to set up for a 3/8 inch deep cut after I do that. And let's just take a real quick measurement. This is 9.5 inches. So I'll go to 9 1/4. Okay, now that I've got a straight edge back here, now I can get rid of this bad section that's out here. And it looks like, we measure that, if we take it down to 8 1/4 inches, we should be able to get rid of this knot. Worked out. Yeah, I'm actually just a little under 8 1/4 inches here. So if I were to take this down to a little under 7 3/4 inches, that should then give me a 3/8 inch piece out here after we take into account the 1/8 inch width of the saw blade. Let's check our measurement here. Okay, that's just a tad heavy of 3/8 of an inch. You know, that fits down into the miter slot very well, and it does sit ever so slightly proud of the surface, which would be good for us gluing this up. And so now what we should be able to do is then get this piece of plywood lined up so that the edge of the plywood is in line with the blade, and then we can attach the runner over on the other side over here into the miter gauge slot, and then I can put some blue tape down on the table saw to protect it, and then I can glue this runner in place underneath this piece of plywood. Now, I've cut the runner down to 36 inches long. When I said that it was a little bit heavy of 3/8 of an inch, I wasn't kidding there. It's actually about 4 thousandths over 3/8 of an inch. And so that is actually very close to 3/8 of an inch. It's another nice use for digital calipers in the shop. That's 0.381. There's 0.378, so that's 3 thousandths over. So I think that'll work out well enough. I put some sawdust down into the bottom of the miter gauge slot to raise this board up ever so slightly to account for the blue tape that I've got applied on each side of the miter gauge slot to hopefully keep the glue from touching the cast iron surface of the table saw. And so now I'm ready to apply some glue here. The runner will be sticking out roughly 3 inches in the front and roughly 2 inches at the back. And that's to allow a little bit more support if the board ends up sticking out beyond the end of this when it's set down to be tapered. Okay, that should be enough glue, I think. And now I've got the rip vent set so that when this board is set down, it's going to extend this board into the blade by maybe a 1/64 of an inch. And the splitter is going to end up getting pushed to the side a little bit, but I think that'll be okay. And once the glue sets up, then what I'll be able to do is run the board through on here to actually get a clean edge at the front. So So I think that'll work out well for us. Make sure that there's no sawdust on the bottom here. Okay, now I need to apply downward pressure onto this board until the glue sets up. I could use a large belt sander to provide a little bit of extra weight. However, I've got some heavy routers here that I think will work out. Just put those down. Okay, I can actually pull this out further toward the end here, I think. Get even pressure. Okay, I'm thinking that's going to be good. So I'll just let this set up for an hour and a half or so, and then I should be able to come out and scrape off any glue that's left over, and then clean up this edge using the table saw. Okay, the glue's had 2 hours to dry. Let's cut the edge of this board using the blade, so that way we know that it's always lined up with the blade. That only removed about a 64th of an inch, which is what I wanted. So now I can get wax applied to this runner as well as the bottom of this unit. But before I do that, what I want to do is cut in the dovetails for the clamps. I found the center at each edge of this board, and I laid out a 3x3 grid that I'll then use to lay out the position of where the dovetail slots will go. What I've done here is I've clamped a straight board that I just ran over the jointer 3 inches from this line right here, so it's right on this line. And because I'm using 2 routers here that both have 6-inch diameter router sub-bases, then this will actually work out for me. So all that I've got to do is just line up this board with each of these lines going across, and then I can do the routing without any difficulty. Now I want the cuts to end a 1/2 inch before I get to the end of the board, so that way there's no risk that this tine here can slide out and come into contact with the blade on the table saw when we're cutting. So that means that because I've got to go in from this end and stop down there, I have to have the guide board on this side of where the router is going to run, which means that when I get out here to this other end, I'll have some difficulty running that because I'll have to have the board on the opposite side. That means that the routers are going to want to drift away from the line as I'm cutting. So I've got to be very careful, run it real slow. I've used this setup guide here to set up the depth of each of the router bits in the MatchFit system. So now I should be all set, ready to go. I'm going to get this other router off the table so it's out of the way. Okay, and I've got the dust extractor hooked up to this router so I don't have chips going all over the place. Okay, now I'll switch over to the other router and repeat the cut using this other router that has a dovetail bit mounted into it. Okay, so that's one of many slots cut. I'll continue cutting the slots, and then we'll bring the camera back. I'm down to where I'm cutting the last 2 slots in this direction, front to back. And these are going to be challenging because I've got to have the guide board over on this side, which means I need to run the router in this direction so that it doesn't try to drift away from this board while I'm doing the cutting. And because I don't want to get within a ½ inch down here, that's going to add an extra complexity to the cut. And so what I'm going to try to do with the straight bit, I'll try to drop it straight down, and then I'll route across, and then when I go to cut using the dovetail bit, I'll come in this direction, but I'll come in very slowly so that hopefully it doesn't drift away from the guide board. That seemed to work out pretty well. I had to do a little bit of cleanup here and then because I didn't go quite far enough with the dovetail bit. Now I need to slide this board over that way so I can get this slot. And cutting the slots in the other direction won't be too much of a problem. However, every time I come up to one of these gaps, the router will try to jump a little bit, so I've got to be prepared for that. Now, I knew that this would take a while, and it certainly did that. Took probably about an hour and a half, maybe, to cut all these. It is quite a time-consuming process cutting 3-inch squares, even when you've got the two routers and you've got everything laid out. I guess that's just the nature of the beast, but it does look good. So now we can take this over to the table saw and try it out and see if it actually works. So I've got a board here that measures 22 inches long, and it's about 4 1/4 inches across here. And what I'd like to do is to remove a triangular section here. I've got the midpoint marked right here all the way down the side, and the end point down here marked. This is 2 inches from this edge here to this edge. And then on the back side, I've done exactly the same thing. You may not be able to see it on the camera. So all I have to do now is to line up this pencil mark right here, which I've extended down, so that it lines up with the plywood. And then I have to line up this mark with the plywood also. I've just raised up the blade and the splitter so that it'll cut through this board. Let's go ahead and give this a shot and see how it works out. Well, that worked out pretty nice. There's the cut. No burning. Now let's see if we can get this other cut done. Okay, I've got the board lined up. Okay, so here's the result. As you can see here, I started it in slightly the wrong spot, but it still turned out okay. It ended up in the right spot down here. So I think that this will work out for an angle jig. It can also be used to straight line rip short boards if you don't have a jointer to joint the edge of the board, or if you need to remove too much material at the edge of the board, such as 3/4 of an inch to get rid of the wane. This could work out for short boards. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.